Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report with me and Stacy Herbert. Hey, you know that underneath the snow, there's little acorns ready to grow. And even though the world is chock-a-block with blizzardous inflation and money printers, there's a seed, an acorn, a plant ready to explode in El Salvador, of freedom and democracy and fun-loving peeps. Stacy.
Right. At first, because when you mentioned snow, I thought you were talking about China on ice, as they call it, and that is Canada. Canada is basically exposing to a lot of people who were naysayers about Bitcoin. It's exposing to Bitcoiners, to people who are not Bitcoiners yet, why El Salvador is on the right path. Because the remarkable stuff happening there in terms of censoring the payments, cutting citizens of Canada off from their banking services is just remarkable, right? So here we are in a world where El Salvador went from just something like 30% of the population have a bank account to now over 70% thanks to Bitcoin. Here in Canada, what you're seeing is the unbanking of their citizens as, you know, due to their protesting. So the government is saying that they're protesting and they're going to cut off their financial services, just like China does with their social credit score. So now we're starting to see the likes of Jim Rickers, according to a Spaces on Twitter that I was on recently. They said that he actually came around and agreed that Bitcoin is helping the truckers in Canada. And of course, the Ruby on Rails inventor also said something.
Yeah, the Ruby on Rails creator goes by DHH on Twitter. Quote, "I still can't believe that this is the protest that would prove every Bitcoin crank a profit. And for me to have to slice a piece of humble pie and admit that I was wrong on crypto's fundamental necessity means Bitcoin, of course, in Western democracy. I was wrong. We need Bitcoin." I mean, this is the process. Everyone capitulates in the end. You get the price you pay for. I'm glad to see Jim Rickers is now starting to see the value proposition, as we mentioned to him over 10 years ago when it was $5. Him and Chris Whalen have been really resistant no-coiners or pre-coiners, as we say. But I think now it's time, fellas, to get on board.
That's the remarkable thing is, as he points out, that he was wrong. And what he was wrong about, what he had said in the past, was essentially that, yes, he could see the value of Bitcoin for developing nations or those who live in a dictatorship, but we are in this Western economy and we have great financial services. Yeah, but until you get cut off from those financial services, and the fact that it's so integrated into everything about your life, if you get cut off from financial services, like everything gets cut off, right? Like you're cut off from all the basic necessities of life. That's what he's saying. He's saying that we all need it, because you need that individual sovereignty, because that is the ultimate check on the government, always. Because if they know that they can't cut you off from financial services like this, then it doesn't even enter their brain. Remember Google's old saying of like, don't be evil? Like the government can't be evil if the citizens have sovereignty.
I think the big shock here is that Canada turned out to be the country where there was an enormous power overreach by the government of Trudeau. He's being condemned by countries all over the world for this egregious power overreach. And countries like El Salvador, nobody had them as being the country to figure out that Bitcoin was a path toward individual sovereignty and toward financial security. And they just reported absolutely incredible GDP numbers, and the tourism is booming, and they're going to double their GDP numbers again next year.
Yeah, and on Twitter, speaking of being on Twitter and Spaces and stuff like that, I have received several DMs from Canadian friends asking me what it is like in El Salvador, and they want to come there, they want to move their family there because they are so alarmed by what is happening in Canada. And that's the point, is like that guy from Ruby on Rails, the inventor of Ruby on Rails, he had always maintained that, yes, third world countries need it, developing nations need it without, because they don't have banking infrastructure, or they have dictators, he's saying. So his argument was now been exposed as everybody needs it. Every individual on earth needs it.
Right, because anyone can become a dictator, and Pierre Trudeau, I think his first name is Pierre. He is kind of French. Justin Trudeau. I'm sorry to make all you French people named Pierre up there in Canada. That was not good, was it? Anyway, Justin Trudeau has the capacity to be a dictator and is the most vile dictator in the world today. Who would have thought the world of hockey pucks and maple syrup would breed such an ugly dictatorial nightmare as Justin Trudeau?
And, Zero Hedge, I know, they're alternative media, and they were saying they have a headline that says Canada moves to make asset freezing under Emergencies Act permanent. But there are people in the audience who, of course, like only just official media. And the similar headline here from CBC.Canada, so official state media, says banks have started to freeze accounts linked to the protest, Freeland says. And a final warning, finance minister says truckers at the protest will be stripped of their insurance as well. If it were in any country that is not part of the, say, G8, we would call this a dictator. We would say that. That's what we would say about these sort of economic moves where you could just deprive a citizen of actual access to their money, their funds, and cut them off from their heating, their electric, their water, their food. Like that's how you buy these products, right? This is how you pay for your goods and services.
Right. They should make Don Cherry Prime Minister or President of Canada. I've been saying that for years. He's the greatest living Canadian today. But nevertheless, we are in an interesting situation where people don't understand something. And we've been saying it on this show for many years. Our friend Simon Dixon makes this point all the time. When you put money into the bank, you no longer own that money. The bank owns that money. They have first claim on your money. It's just contractually, statutorily true. You do not own your money once you put it into the bank. So these types of freezes and bail-ins are in the hands of a lunatic like Trudeau. Is obviously somebody. He should put down the Molson, buddy.
The point is that there were a lot of people who watched this program over the past 12 years, and they would say, it would be people like the Ruby on Rails guy and say, Ruby on Rails, yeah. And he would say, this is just conspiracy theory. Like how outlandish to think or to say, as Keiser Report does, that back in 2011 or 12, that, everybody around the world, including Americans, including Canadians, including Europeans and Brits, would need Bitcoin, that they would need this because bail-ins are coming. We were warning about bail-ins. This is Tone Vase on that very Spaces I was talking about. He was saying that he came to Bitcoin because of Keiser Report. He watched Keiser Report, and what finally got him to buy it was because of Cyprus and our coverage of Cyprus and how the bail-ins and what they did to individuals in Cyprus was the reason to Bitcoin. And if Cyprus is a Western economy, it's in part of Europe. And so why did this guy not even see that was back in 2013? We're in 2022, it's only going to get worse.
And as we've also been covering now for a few years, the central bank digital currencies will exacerbate this ability. And as I've said also many years ago, your money will have an expiration date. They'll issue it in your electronic wallet, and if you don't spend it within a few months, it'll disappear. This will solve the inflation problem. Or they have a list of stuff that you can buy and you can't buy. And of course, social credit, the Chinese social credit scoring would be very easy to implement. It's already effectively in place in Canada. So Canada and China have merged essentially. I don't know how that happened, but I know there's a lot of French spoken in Montreal. They should learn their Chinese now.
Well, they certainly, if you look at the replies to a lot of these tweets, you'll see that there is a huge amount of support by some of the population to pull their fellow citizens off the financial grid. And you see it even in the language that is used in a CBC article describing what the government is doing. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland said Thursday that financial institutions have moved quickly to freeze the accounts of people linked to the demonstrations in Ottawa, leaving an unknown number of protesters in financial limbo. Freeland vowed to take more accounts offline in the coming days in an attempt to starve the organizers of the funds they need to continue their occupation of the nation's capital.
Let me explain this in terms that Canadians will understand. Let's say it's the 1970s and Dave Schultz of the Philadelphia Flyers, he starts hacking Bobby Orr with his stick right in his face. Okay. Now that would obviously be a severe penalty. Might even be ejected from the game and get suspended from the league. So this is what your premier, their Justin Trudeau, is the Dave Schultz of world leaders. And he's taking his stick and he's bashing the face of every Canadian right now. Okay, now would you tolerate that, Canadian people? I don't think so. Not the Canadians that I know.
Everybody in Canada will understand that because they're hockey players by at birth. So, but I'm not a hockey player, so I don't know. But quickly, you know, in terms of what's happening in El Salvador, at the same time that this is happening in Canada, we see this from President Najib Bukele. He says, I'm sending 52 legal reforms to Congress to remove red tape, reduce bureaucracy, create tax incentives, citizenship in exchange for investments, new securities laws, stability contracts, etc. The plan is simple. As the world falls into tyranny, we will create a haven for freedom.
Okay, let me again use hockey terminology to explain what's happening to Canadians, okay? What President Bukele of El Salvador sees an open net. There's an open net. There's a minute to go. And everyone around the world has pulled their goalie out, the goalie of freedom and democracy. And Bukele's saying, oh my God, there's an empty net. So he's taking that shot of freedom and democracy and shooting at the open net. And as a result, people are migrating to El Salvador and his economy is booming. Okay, so put that in your maple syrup and try to understand what I'm saying.
All I know is I've been to one hockey game and I went with Max and I said, Max, this is way too violent. This is like a very aggressive game.
That was nothing. That was nothing. You know, good Canadian style hockey, as Don Cherry recommends. That's what you need to get back to. Man, the day they took Don Cherry off the Canadian Broadcasting Network, that's the day Canada basically died. Anyway, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Nomi Prins, author of many classic books about markets, finance, central banks, and the corruption therein. She's going to be out with a new book in October called Permanent Distortion. Nomi, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Max.
Permanent Distortion, I think I can guess what it's about just from the title, which is great. Tell us, what is it about?
So as we know, because we have been talking about this for years, there is a disconnect, a massive gap between how the markets behave and between what people experience in their everyday real lives in the real economy. I, in this book, talk about how this is not a temporary phenomenon, but why it is permanent. This is where we're at. And what comes from this point is what gets both interesting and complicated. But the reality is, because of the boatloads of central bank money that has been fabricated out of absolutely nothing after the financial crisis of 2008, the pandemic in 2020, we are at a position in the world where the deluge of all of this has only jet propulsioned up asset prices, financial markets, and left the economy behind. And that has a lot of ramifications.
Right. Well, the word permanent is, I think, new to your lexicon. And new to the whole lexicon of those who make observation of markets their living and what they write about. There's usually an idea that markets are temporarily distorted or markets are temporarily misaligned. But what you're talking about is permanent distortion, which, I mean, how is that different than saying markets are now permanently broken?
Well, they've been permanently broken. That's absolutely true. Why I call it permanent distortion, and yeah, it wasn't a term that I came about lightly, because I have been writing about all of the pitfalls and crises and corruption and collusion and everything else between Wall Street, the Fed, central banks, governments, etc. But why it's permanent is because there is such an external amount of fabricated money that has found its way into all of the cracks and crevices of the financial markets in so many different ways that it's impossible to ever have any of that come back. Even if the Fed, for example, were to cut its asset book by, like $500 billion or even $1 trillion, these enormous numbers that we talk about, it wouldn't change the fact that that cat is out of the bag, that from now on, we are in a condition that there's no returning from. It is not temporary. And so what happens from here is really a new era. And that's why I consider the distortion to be permanent, and what happens from here to be the next phase of where we go. We're not coming back.
Right. I saw a report this morning. The Federal Reserve Bank in D.C. is continuing to buy assets, purchase assets. All of the talk about unwinding quantitative easing and rate raises at some point, it seems like a pantomime that's been going on now for 30 years. And we're truly at a point where, as we say, you can't taper a Ponzi. You know, going all the way back to 1980, to the S&L crisis, then the dot-com crisis, then the subprime crisis, there's this natural cascade down of interest rates. And with every crisis that's solved by printing more money, it's also accompanied by lower interest rates. And it seems like we're at a juncture, and your title kind of infers this permanent distortion, where there won't be any return to a normal rate of by the central bank of a neutral rate of 5%. So isn't that therefore the beginning of what we've called neo-feudalism? It not only is it permanent distortion, but it's a permanent money printing and power grab by the people doing the money printing. Isn't this neo-feudalism, Nomi?
Yeah, it absolutely is. It's just more technological than the old feudalism, obviously, because of where we're at on that realm. You know, the fact that even in the early days of the pandemic, the Fed and other central banks around the world could literally double the size of their asset books in no time. This is actually more of the condition of where we're at in terms of, as you call it, neo-feudalism or techno neo-feudalism than we were at in the wake of the financial crisis. You know, at the point at which we went into 2020, even before the coronavirus was a thing, before it was on the maps, et cetera, before, lockdowns, before all of that, the Fed had already been creeping up its asset book from a interim low since the financial crisis of 3.7 trillion after it had been at 4.5 trillion to 4.1 trillion. Why? Because Wall Street needed the money in sort of the background, in secret. So the Fed's like, okay, here, fine. But it went from 4.1 to basically 9 in the period of less than 2 years. That just indicates that the wherewithal that we believe to have had no limit has no limit in actuality. And that when they can, they will produce the fabricated amount of money that they believe they need. And the thing is that the lie about all of it, right, and it has been, is that this money is supposed to go into the real economy. And one of the things that I analyze throughout the world in this book and have for some time, but is that this money obviously does not go into the real economy. You cannot trace it. You cannot look at the growth by any parameter in the real economy and consider that to be in any way, shape, or form equivalent to the tremendous growth in the stock market and in the leveraged markets financially around the planet.
Just have to look at the money velocity chart and see that it's continuing to trend down towards zero to know that the money doesn't enter the real economy. It's just printed and stolen. Now, of course, going all the way back to Occupy Wall Street and the Gilets Jaunes movement in France and the Canadian truckers up in Ottawa, there is a global pushback. There is a global insurrection against banker occupation. And when you talk about permanent distortion, in the past, when you've had feudalism, or call it neo-feudalism, and broken markets and power grab by the top 0.1%, this generally means we're at an inflection point and we have an insurrection. It seems like we're at that point, Nomi.
We are, and that's one of the reasons, and obviously you and Stacy are champions of this, but that we've had such a pivot to a more decentralized financial system and to a Bitcoin growth in terms of the crypto markets, because whether one believes in an appreciation of it as an asset or a use currency or whatever else, it's a pushback. And that whole environment is a pushback to this this growth of fiat currencies throughout all of this time. And it's a technological pushback because the power is there to create an alternative. And it's also a psychological pushback because it arose from the ashes of the financial crisis of 2008 when central banks just started their ability, and they've created money throughout the Fed since 1913, but started the ability to really go into overdrive and not care about what that could do to the markets or to the people who aren't involved in the markets. And so we're at that inflection point where technology and a seeking of an alternative to this environment is literally just starting. And we may have been in it for the year since the wake of the financial crisis, but it's really just getting going.
Let me throw another phrase out there that I just thought of: the normalization of the grotesque. So a reason I mention this is you've got a quote in your book, quote, "A funhouse financial realm that thrives even in times of social and political disorder." So the funhouse financial realm is being normalized. The meme stocks, the Hertz going bankrupt, but being traded by memers, and then finding out that it's a hedge fund that's owned by Citadel with a former Fed Chairman Bernanke involved. So the normalization of massive fraud, the normalization of complete failure of price discovery, the normalization of failed markets, you call the financial funhouse. It kind of bleeds over into society. You know, men and women getting grotesque amounts of plastic surgery, I would posit, is an outgrowth of these failed markets as well. The normalization of the grotesque is one of the side effects of having failed markets and a failure of adequate, genuine price discovery, Nomi. And I don't think people are willing to take on board really the negative externalities that we see in society. For example, the massive skyrocketing in deaths and suicides in America and drug overdoses. Again, a negative externality from allowing these markets to run through this, as you call, a funhouse financial realm. Your thoughts?
Well, yeah, the idea of a fun house, and again, it's for whom? It's for those in control of producing, the mechanism that keeps it going for them. So that's the idea of just fabricating money ad nauseum and forever, and that does leave behind and creates that additional anxiety in that dust everybody else in the world, and the result of that. And we've already seen this even before the extra overdrive that happened with money creation post-pandemic, is that we've had a record number of social uprisings, physical uprisings, of civil uprisings at the same time. Obviously, uprisings have happened throughout history in different areas of the world. But 2019, for example, we had the most amount of social uprisings around the planet in any given year. And that's not just because people are specific to their area, whether it's Hong Kong related to China's super power over them and all of that. It's more about this collective idea, this collective notion that people are just disconnected from the means of making a living, of seeing a sustainable future and everything else. And what that creates is tension in the streets, obviously rejections of governments, a flip-flop of governments, where we've seen throughout the world, we've gone more progressive, then we go more conservative. We do that anyway throughout elections, but that has accelerated in terms of what we've seen in the post-financial crisis era and through today. Is there's a lot more of shifting going on with governments around the world that creates more political instability. Again, that harms people because that uncertainty hurts them in real life. And so you talk about the grotesque. I was just thinking about the theater of the absurd when we were speaking before, Max. But we are in this sort of absurd ultra reality or meta reality, where a lot of what's also been growing are different forms of metaverse types of sort of alternatives to life, and that's also an outcome of this permanently distorted or permanent distortion in the world.
Right. Well, you wrote a book called Collusion, which details central banks colluding instead of what they should be doing, and that is competing. So it makes sense, therefore, that you would have a global insurrection against banker occupation. So it's a global war at this point. So the book is called Permanent Distortion. It's out in October. I guess it's a companion piece with some of those other fine works you've you've put out, including collusion, all the president's bankers, and a few more titles as well, Nomi. You're quite the prolific writer.
Well, thank you. There's a lot going on. It was fashioned to be the sort of last of the trio of all the president's bankers, collusion, and now permanent distortion. There's kind of an evolution. Go back in history, look at the relationships between Wall Street and Washington, the power that infused throughout the world, and then the development of the Fed, and then obviously in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, how that became a global collusion among central banks and basically disconnected the real world from the financial world by even more. And now we're in this condition where that distortion is permanent and where it has a dramatic impact and will have a continued dramatic impact on society, on civil unrest, on all sorts of, to talk about financial insurrections and everything else, whether it be physical or technological.
Nomi Prins, thanks for being on Keiser Report.
Thank you.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Nomi Prins. Her latest book out in October, Permanent Distortion. Till next time. Bye, y'all.